Okay, so this is still Unit 8, and it's still Segment 1, but this is the second video. So this particular segment is really long. There's a potential that there could be a third, but we'll see. But anyway, we left with the first video talking about an example of an adaptation. So having longer and stronger legs for a cheetah allows them to run faster, which would then allow them to capture prey easier, evade any predators they might encounter, and they would then survive and be able to reproduce. Well, in their reproduction, they'd be passing along those longer, stronger legs to their offspring, leading to, in the future, a population that would have even the longer, stronger legs. So we've seen over time cheetah species as a whole changing in that they're getting more sleek and, those legs are changing. Here's in this little diagram, you can see that there are lizards and there's variation within the environment. The lizards are all different colors, and with predation with the animals, it looks like a cat paw here, that would eat these lizards, they're finding the darker lizards easier, just their coloration, and so over time the survivors will reproduce, and you end up with something that's like no more dark colored ones in this particular environment. Could that change? Could the environment change so that dark is more apt to survive? Sure. Can you see what's here? So in nature, when you look at it, when you think about adaptations and fitness and all of that together like Darwin did, when you look at something like this, you think, wow, how did it get to be this way? And you have to consider that somewhere in their ancestral past, a mutation occurred to allow for their look to change and become very much stick-like. So the blending, the ability for these insects to blend into their environment is so amazingly profound that these things are able to survive even better because of this adaptation and allowed to produce offspring. Survival of the fittest really truly is natural selection, and these lead to evolution. Descent with modification, that is a phrase, and that what that is it means that when you look at species today, especially species that are closely related or resemble one another, looking at several lines of evidence, fossil, embryology, all of those things, you can actually stem that back to a common ancestor. And so sometimes you'll see these trees. So over here, the very bottom of this map kind of shows branching. So there was a branch off, and then as the time went by, so here are these different scenes, different eras, at periods, as this time goes by, you're getting more and more branching off, more and more different from one another. But you can stem it all back to a common ancestor that was way back here, that had these similar bone structures in their vertebrae. And I'm not sure, I think this is their tailbone, I'm not sure. But descent with modification, meaning you can go back in time in the fossil record and see that there was a common ancestor, and it has over time, going up in time, you can see that they've gotten very different from one another. And this happens because of natural selection. They have a shared common ancestor. So you'll also hear the phrase common descent. And this is that all species were derived from common ancestors. And the example here is the horse. So there was a common ancestor. It doesn't mean, this horse didn't bring about this horse. It's more, they all kind of, as generations occurred and these mutations were happening that were allowing the organism to be more fit in their environment, they developed into all of these different variations of horse. Summary of evolution theory, the theory of evolution by Darwin. Individual organisms differ. And some of that variation is actually inherited. Some of it is environmentally influenced, but some of it is inherited. And it's that inherited stuff that is passed on to offspring or to next generations that's important. Organisms produce more offspring than can actually survive, so that there's competition. And then there are some organisms that do not survive, that do survive and do not reproduce. And without reproduction, you have nothing to carry over into the next generation. They have to compete for limited resources. Some individuals have adaptive characteristics that actually enable them to survive and reproduce better than other organisms. So with that variation in the environment, like the different colored beetles, certain variations are allowed to survive and reproduce better because of their environment and the environmental pressures. These organisms will then pass on those traits to their offspring. So other organisms, will die or have fewer offspring that are not best fit or best adapted for their environment. So this process of natural selection actually causes the species as a whole to change over time, but it takes so many generations, which is why it's very hard to distinguish, because especially with humans, my heavens, we only have 1 or 2 kids, right? At most, like, I've heard of people having like 5, 6, 10, but usually it's much less. And so you're not going to see, plus we're not thrown into the wild, right? We're not, competing for those resources that are out in nature and in the wild. We're kind of pampered a little bit, being higher thought processors. So species alive today are descended with modification from ancestral species that lived in the distant past. And back to Darwin in his voyage on the HMS Beagle, he collected lots of fossils. And he found that some were very much like modern organisms, but some were very, very different. And a fossil, by definition, is traces and preserved remains of ancient life. So the preserved remains can be an insect in amber, like what you see up here. Traces can even be footprints in the rock, which is not what you see here. This is actually like a fern-type plant. But a footprint can even be considered a fossil, friends. It's evidence of something that lived in the past. And because sediments can be dated, right, and they are layered according to the date in which they were laid, we can actually go back in time and see what life was like in the past. So there are 4 evidence of evolution. You're going to hear about this, or you're going to see it on quizzes and tests. So there are 4 evidence of evolution that Darwin was pulling together, showing, and this evidence of evolution shows common ancestry. There is so much evidence in the fossil record that allows us to piece together the mystery of the change over species over time. A geographic distribution, homologous body structures, and similarities in embryology. Darwin at the time only had embryology to look at, but now we know about DNA. For heaven's sakes, DNA has been huge in this evidence of evolution. Technology became advanced, and we became understanding about how genes are found in DNA, and how DNA codes for proteins. And there's so much now that we know that he didn't then, but he still was able to put together the embryology. Darwin used each of these for his theory, and we still use these plus more today to gather even more evidence. Friends, there's been so much evidence gathered. We're going to talk about each one. So the fossil record provides evidence about the history of life on Earth. It shows how groups of organisms have changed over time. Fossils occur in a specific order. There's a time and sediment layer in which they were laid, which allows us to map back in time. It shows modern organisms have unicellular ancestors. The fossil record shows how different groups of organisms, including species, have changed over time. 99%, that's insane, 99% of all species that have ever lived on the planet are extinct. They're died out. When you look, if you have a moment to search back life through the different eras, you will be astounded by the number of extinctions that have actually happened. And those are evidenced in the fossil record. My heavens, we can see it. Geographic distribution of living species is another line of evidence. That means that and Darwin saw this, animals from different ancestors looked similar on different continents. So Animals that came from a different ancestor were found on different continents with the same adaptations. How can that happen? How can all these different birds, for example, have wings? How does that happen? Well, they all are adapted for flight, and they all have the pressures in the environment for flight. So animals were living under similar ecological conditions, and we call those similar pressures of natural selection. And so nature was selecting those that are best fit with those adaptations for their environment, allowed to survive and reproduce. So those are similar adaptations. Pouched organisms, all these pictures are showing organisms that use pouches for their offspring, to hold their offspring. And you got a bird and you have a mammal. Like, what the heck? They're not the same embryological, but they have the similar, adaptation because the ecosystem, the pressures were similar for that. Homologous body structures. These are structures that have different mature forms but actually develop from the same embryonic tissue. So a person's arm is the same bone number and somewhat structure as a wing of a bird, which is the same structure, see the bones there, same number as a fin, okay, and this leg of the lion. So they all are similar, which shows common ancestry. There's something called vestigial organs, and I swear I think there's like 3 or 4 questions on the test about this. And this is when an organ is so reduced in size just because it's not necessary for survival for that particular organism, it's not necessary for reproduction, that it just shrinks up and becomes non-usable, and here you have a whale that has the existence of a leg bone. Right there. There's no purpose for that. And so that's a vestigial organ. In humans, we have many. Darwin's point on the ear. There's no purpose. And then ear muscles, which is pointing to the eye, but ear muscles. Tonsils, wisdom teeth, appendix. A lot of times, if we have any issues with this, like infections or anything, we have to go with those things removed, and we're totally fine with it, because they're not needed for survival or for reproduction. Body hair, for humans, not necessary. For apes, anything that is out in the wild, other mammals, very important because they need that protection from the environment. A coccyx at the end of your tailbone, that is your tailbone, and males having nipples, not necessary. Vestigial. Okay, the 4th line of evidence, similarities in embryology. This is an embryo, remember, is when the egg is fertilized and becomes a developing organism. That's an embryo at that point. And this is very early stages of development. The organisms with backbones are actually very similar looking in their embryological development. Here's a salamander. This is a human. Oh my God, look how similar it is to a salamander. Here's a rabbit, chicken, and fish. Very, very similar. So showing common descent, common ancestry. DNA evidence in the form of DNA is huge, huge for showing how closely related organisms are, how early on in their ancestral past did they have a common ancestor. Biological similarities, looking at amino acids and cytochromes and proteins. Now, Darwin did not have this available to him. We do now, and we use it like crazy to look at relationships and understand common ancestry. So how can 2 very different organisms have very similar genes? Common ancestor. I think that might be it. So this is the last slide, and the time is up. So shared common ancestry. Remember Darwin's 4 arguments, evidences for shared ancestry. You need those for your quiz or test. Fossil record, geographic distribution, homologous structures, and similar embryology. There's 2 more genetic factors to consider that Darwin didn't have access to, and that's your DNA, RNA, and biochemistry, including proteins. Now we look at those for looking at similarities too. Remember, all organisms use DNA and RNA to pass on genetic information to the next generation. This, my friends, is called heredity. And that is it for segment 1. Only 2 videos total.